A woman, her coat pulled tightly around her, hurried toward a waiting taxi. The driver, impatient, tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, his breath fogging up the window. Just as she reached for the door handle, a low, guttural growl cut through the night. She froze. From the shadows of a nearby alley, a German shepherd emerged, its fur matted and dripping, its eyes glowing like embers in the dim light. The dog planted itself firmly between her and the taxi, its body rigid, teeth bared in a silent snarl. "Hey, get out of here!" the taxi driver shouted, rolling down his window. But the dog didn't budge. It stared at the woman, its gaze intense, almost pleading. Her heart raced. Something about the dog's demeanor sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't just aggression, it was desperation. The dog let out a sharp bark, then turned and trotted a few steps toward the alley, stopping to look back at her. It barked again, louder this time, as if urging her to follow. The taxi driver groaned. "Lady, you getting in or not? I don't have all night." She hesitated, her eyes locked on the dog. There was something wrong, something deeply unsettling. Against her better judgment, she took a step toward the alley. The dog's tail gave a faint wag, and it disappeared into the shadows. The taxi driver cursed under his breath and drove off, leaving her alone in the rain. She followed the dog, her shoes splashing through puddles, her pulse quickening with every step. The alley was narrow, lined with overflowing dumpsters and broken crates. The dog waited at the far end, standing over something on the ground. As she approached, her breath caught in her throat. Lying in the mud was a man, unconscious, his face pale and his clothes soaked. A pool of dark liquid spread beneath him, mixing with the rainwater. The dog let out a whine, nudging the man's hand with its nose. Her heart stopped. This wasn't just a stray dog, it was a guardian, a protector, and it had just led her to a scene that would change everything. The woman, Emily, knelt beside the man, her hands trembling as she felt for a pulse. It was faint but there. She pulled out her phone, her fingers slipping on the wet screen as she dialed for help. The dog watched her intently, its ears twitching at every sound. "It's okay," she whispered, more to herself than to the dog. "Help is coming." The dog's eyes never left her. It was a large German shepherd, its coat once sleek and black but now dull and streaked with mud. Its ribs were visible beneath its skin, and a deep gash ran along its side, partially hidden by matted fur. Despite its injuries, the dog stood tall, its posture protective, as if guarding the man with its life. Emily reached out slowly, her hand hovering near the dog's head. "Good boy," she murmured. "You're a good boy, aren't you?" The dog flinched but didn't move away. Its eyes darted to her hand, then back to her face. She could see the conflict in its gaze, fear warring with a desperate need for trust. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. The dog's ears flattened and it took a step back, its body tense. Emily held up her hands. "It's okay," she said softly. "They're here to help." Paramedics arrived moments later, their bright flashlights cutting through the darkness. The dog retreated further into the shadows, its growl low and warning. One of the paramedics approached cautiously, but the dog bared its teeth, a clear message to stay back. "Ma'am, you need to step away," the paramedic said, his voice firm. Emily shook her head. "He won't hurt me. He's just scared." She turned back to the dog, her voice calm and steady. "It's okay. You did good. You saved him." The dog's growl softened, but its eyes remained wary. Emily reached into her pocket and pulled out a granola bar, the only thing she had. She unwrapped it slowly, holding it out in her palm. The dog sniffed the air, its nose twitching. After a long moment, it took a tentative step forward, then another. Its nose brushed her hand, and she felt the warmth of its breath. Then, with a gentleness that surprised her, it took the food from her palm. The paramedics worked quickly, loading the man onto a stretcher. Emily stayed with the dog, her hand resting lightly on its head. It didn't pull away this time, but she could feel the tension in its body, the way it flinched at every sudden movement. "We need to get him to the hospital," one of the paramedics said, You coming? Emily hesitated. She couldn't leave the dog here, not like this. But before she could decide, the dog suddenly turned and bolted, disappearing into the night. Emily stood in the rain, staring at the spot where the dog had vanished. Her mind raced with questions. Who was the man? Why had the dog been protecting him? And where had it gone? The paramedics loaded the man into the ambulance, and one of them turned to her. You know him? She shook her head. No, the dog led me to him. The paramedic raised an eyebrow. A dog? A German shepherd, she said. It was hurt, but it wouldn't let me near him until I followed it. The paramedic exchanged a glance with his partner. Strange. Well, we'll take it from here. You should get out of the rain. Emily nodded, but as the ambulance drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. She pulled out her phone and called a friend who worked at the local animal shelter. Hey, Sarah, she said when the call connected. I need your help. By the time she got home, her clothes were soaked, and her mind was spinning. She couldn't stop thinking about the dog, its injuries, its fear, the way it had looked at her. There was a story here, one that went far deeper than a random act of heroism. The next morning, she went to the hospital to check on the man. He was still unconscious, hooked up to machines, his face pale and drawn. The nurses told her he had no identification, no wallet, nothing to indicate who he was. As she left the hospital, her phone buzzed. It was Sarah. I think I found something, Sarah said. There's a report of a missing German shepherd from a few weeks ago. The owner's description matches the dog you saw. But here's the weird part. The owner's name is the same as the man you found. Emily's heart skipped a beat. What? Yes, Sarah said. His name is Daniel Hart, and according to the report, he and his dog went missing under suspicious circumstances. Emily's mind raced. What had she stumbled into? And where was the dog now? As she walked to her car, she noticed something on the ground, a muddy paw print leading away from the hospital. Her heart pounded. The dog was still out there, and it was watching. Emily followed the paw prints, her heart pounding with every step. The trail led her through a quiet neighborhood, past rows of houses with their windows dark and curtains drawn. The rain had stopped, but the air was still heavy with moisture, and the streets glistened under the pale light of the rising sun. The prints turned down a narrow side street, and Emily hesitated. The street was lined with abandoned warehouses, their windows broken, and doors hanging ajar. It was the kind of place people avoided, especially at this hour, but the dog had come this way, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it needed her help. She took a deep breath and stepped into the shadows of the first warehouse. The air inside was damp and cold, and the faint smell of rust and decay made her stomach churn. She pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The paw prints were faint now, barely visible in the dust and debris that littered the floor. She followed them deeper into the warehouse, her footsteps echoing in the vast empty space. The beam of her flashlight caught something on the ground, a torn piece of fabric, stained with what looked like blood. Her breath hitched. She picked it up, her fingers trembling. It was from a shirt, and the blood was fresh. Hello? She called out, her voice wavering. Is anyone here? There was no answer, but she thought she heard a faint whimper. She turned toward the sound, her flashlight sweeping across the room. In the far corner, she saw a pile of old crates, and behind them, a pair of glowing eyes. The dog. It was crouched low, its body tense, its ears flattened against its head. Emily approached slowly, her hands raised. It's okay, she said, softly. I'm not going to hurt you. The dog let out a low growl, but it didn't move. As she got closer, she could see the gash on its side, now crusted with dried blood. Its ribs were more pronounced than before, and its breathing was shallow. You're hurt, she whispered. Let me help you. She knelt a few feet away, holding out her hand. The dog watched her warily, its eyes flicking between her face and her outstretched hand. After a long moment, it took a tentative step forward, then another. Its nose brushed her fingers, and she felt the warmth of its breath. Good boy, she murmured. You're safe now." But just as the dog began to relax, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. The dog spun around, its growl turning into a snarl. Emily's heart leaped into her throat as she turned her flashlight toward the sound. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light. Emily couldn't make out their face, but she could see the glint of something in their hand. A knife. "Well, well," a man's voice said, cold and mocking. "Looks like we've got a visitor." The dog stepped in front of Emily, its body rigid, its teeth bared. The man took a step forward, and the dog let out a deafening bark, the sound echoing through the warehouse. "Stay back," Emily shouted, her voice shaking. The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Or what? You'll sick your mud on me?" He took another step, and the dog lunged, snapping at the air. The man swung the knife, and Emily screamed as the blade grazed the dog's shoulder. The dog yelped but didn't back down, its growl growing louder. Emily scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. She had to do something, but she was unarmed, and the man was between her and the exit. The man advanced, his eyes locked on the dog. "You've caused me enough trouble," he snarled. "Time to put you down." Emily's heart pounded as she looked around for something, anything to defend herself. Her flashlight beam caught a metal pipe lying on the ground a few feet away. She lunged for it, her fingers closing around the cold metal just as the man raised the knife. The dog leaped at him, its teeth sinking into his arm. The man shouted in pain, dropping the knife, and Emily swung the pipe with all her strength. It connected with his side, and he stumbled back, cursing. "Run!" she shouted at the dog, but it didn't move. It stood its ground, its eyes fixed on the man. The man recovered quickly, his face twisted with rage. He grabbed the knife and charged at Emily, but the dog intercepted him, knocking him to the ground. The two struggled, the man's curses mingling with the dog's snarls. Emily swung the pipe again, this time aiming for the man's head. He dodged, but the blow caught his shoulder and he dropped the knife again. The dog seized the opportunity, clamping its jaws around his arm and dragging him away from Emily. The man screamed, thrashing wildly, but the dog held on. Emily grabbed the knife and backed away, her hands trembling. "Call it off," the man shouted, his voice panicked. "Call it off, or I'll kill you both." Emily hesitated, her eyes darting between the man and the dog. She didn't know what to do. If she called the dog off, the man might attack again. But if she didn't, the dog might get hurt. Before she could decide, the sound of sirens filled the air. The man's eyes widened, and he shoved the dog away, scrambling to his feet. He glared at Emily, his face twisted with hatred. "This isn't over," he spat, then turned and ran, disappearing into the shadows. Emily collapsed to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The dog limped over to her, its tail wagging weakly. She wrapped her arms around it, tears streaming down her face. "You saved me," she whispered. "You brave, brave boy." The police arrived moments later, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Emily sat on the ground, the dog curled up beside her, its head resting on her lap. She stroked its fur gently, her fingers trembling as she traced the outline of its wounds. "Are you okay?" one of the officers asked, kneeling beside her. Emily nodded, though she wasn't sure if it was true. Her mind was still reeling from the encounter, and her body felt like it had been through a war. The dog lifted its head, its eyes meeting hers. There was something in its gaze, gratitude maybe, or relief. It let out a soft whine, and Emily's heart ached. "We need to get you both checked out," the officer said. "Can you stand?" Emily nodded again and slowly got to her feet. The dog stood too, though it wobbled slightly. One of the officers reached out to help, but the dog growled, its ears flattening. "It's okay," Emily said quickly. "He's just scared." She knelt beside the dog, her voice soft and soothing. "They're here to help, I promise." The dog looked at her, its eyes searching hers. After a long moment, it let out a sigh and leaned against her leg. The officers helped them into the back of a patrol car, and Emily held the dog close as they drove to the hospital. The dog rested its head on her lap, its breathing slow and steady. "Adieu?" The hospital. A vet was waiting to examine the dog. Emily stayed by its side, her hand resting on its head as the vet cleaned its wounds and bandaged its injuries. The dog flinched a few times but didn't growl or snap. "He's been through a lot," the vet said, her voice gentle. "But he's strong, he'll recover." Emily nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you," the vet smiled. "You're lucky to have each other." Emily looked down at the dog, her heart swelling with emotion. She didn't know its name or its story, but she knew one thing for certain. This dog had saved her life, and she wasn't going to let it go. As the vet finished up, Emily knelt beside the dog, her hand resting on its head. "You're safe now," she whispered. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you." The dog looked at her, its tail giving a faint wag. For the first time, it leaned into her touch, its body relaxing. Emily felt a tear slide down her cheek. In that moment, she knew she had found something special, a bond that went beyond words, a connection that would change both of their lives forever. The police escorted Emily and the dog to a safe location, a small, cozy cabin on the outskirts of town that belonged to a friend of hers. The drive was quiet, the dog resting its head on her lap, its breathing steady but shallow. Emily stroked its fur, her mind racing with questions. Who was the man with the knife? What had he wanted with the dog? And why had the dog risked its life to protect her? When they arrived at the cabin, the dog hesitated at the door, its ears twitching as it sniffed the air. Emily knelt beside it, her voice soft and reassuring. "It's okay," she said. "This is a safe place." The dog looked at her, its eyes searching hers. After a long moment, it took a tentative step inside, its tail wagging faintly. Emily followed, her heart swelling with relief. She spent the next few hours tending to the dog's wounds, cleaning them carefully and applying fresh bandages. The dog flinched a few times but didn't growl or snap. It seemed to understand that she was trying to help. As night fell, Emily lit a fire in the fireplace and sat on the floor beside the dog, a blanket draped over her shoulders. The dog lay next to her, its head resting on her lap. She stroked its fur gently, her mind drifting back to the events of the day. "You're a hero, you know that?" she whispered. "You saved my life." The dog looked up at her, its eyes soft and trusting. For the first time, it let out a quiet sigh, its body relaxing completely. But just as Emily began to relax, a loud knock at the door made her jump. The dog's head shot up, its ears flattening as it let out a low growl. Emily's heart pounded as she stood, her eyes darting to the door. "Who is it?" she called, her voice trembling. "Police," a voice replied. "We need to speak with you." Emily hesitated, then opened the door a crack. Two officers stood on the porch, their faces grim. "We've identified the man you encountered," one of them said. "His name is Marcus Reed. He's wanted in connection with a series of animal trafficking cases. The dog you found, it's one of his victims." Emily's stomach churned. "Animal trafficking?" The officer nodded. "Reed has been kidnapping dogs and selling them to illegal fighting rings. The German Shepherd you found, it was one of his prized fighters. But it escaped, and he's been hunting it ever since." Emily looked down at the dog, her heart breaking. "That's why he was so protective," she murmured. "He's been through hell." The officer handed her a card. "If you see or hear anything, call us immediately. Reed is dangerous, and he's still out there." Emily nodded, her hands trembling as she took the card. "Thank you." As the officers left, she closed the door and leaned against it, her mind racing. The dog stood beside her, its body tense, its eyes fixed on the door. "It's okay," she said softly. "He's not going to hurt you. Not while I'm here." The dog looked up at her, its tail giving a faint wag. For the first time, it pressed its nose against her hand, a silent gesture of trust. Over the next few days, Emily and the dog settled into a routine. She named him Max, a simple name that seemed to suit his strong, protective nature. Max's wounds began to heal and his energy returned, though he remained wary of strangers and loud noises. Emily spent hours researching Marcus Reed and the illegal dogfighting ring he was involved in. She learned that Max had been one of several dogs rescued from a raid months ago, but Reed had managed to escape with a few of them. Max had been one of the lucky ones. He had fought back and escaped, but not without scars, both physical and emotional. One evening, as Emily sat by the fire with Max, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah, her friend at the animal shelter. "I found something," Sarah's message read. "There's a news article about a dog-fighting ring that was busted a few months ago. One of the dogs was a German shepherd named Titan. The description matches Max." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She opened the article and scanned it quickly. The details were chilling. Dogs forced to fight, beaten and starved, their spirits broken. But Titan, the German shepherd, had been different. He had fought back, attacking one of the handlers and escaping into the night. Emily looked down at Max, her eyes filling with tears. "You're Titan, aren't you?" she whispered. Max looked up at her, his tail wagging faintly. It was as if he understood. Emily wrapped her arms around him, her heart swelling with pride. "You're a survivor," she said. "And you're safe now, I promise." One night, Emily was awakened by a low growl. She sat up, her heart pounding, and saw Max standing at the foot of the bed, his ears flattened and his body rigid. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. Max let out a soft whine and trotted to the window, his nose pressed against the glass. Emily followed, her stomach churning as she peered outside. A shadow moved in the trees, and her breath caught in her throat. It was Marcus Reed. Emily's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. But before she could dial, Max let out a deafening bark and charged toward the door. "Max, no!" she shouted, but it was too late. He was already out the door, his growls echoing through the night. Emily grabbed a flashlight and ran after him, her heart pounding. She found Max standing at the edge of the woods, his body tense, his eyes fixed. "On the darkness, Max, come," she called, her voice shaking, but Max didn't move. He stood his ground, his growls growing louder. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. Marcus Reed, his face twisted with rage. He held a knife in his hand, the blade glinting in the moonlight. "You think you can take what's mine?" he snarled. Max lunged, his teeth sinking into Reed's arm. Reed shouted in pain, dropping the knife, and Emily swung the flashlight with all her strength. It connected with his head, and he stumbled back, cursing. The police arrived moments later, their sirens wailing. Reed tried to run, but Max tackled him to the ground, his growls fierce and unrelenting. As the officers handcuffed Reed, Emily knelt beside Max, her hands trembling as she stroked his fur. "You did it," she whispered. "You stopped him." Max looked up at her, his tail wagging weakly. For the first time, he rested his head against her, a silent gesture of trust and love. With Marcus Reed behind bars, Emily and Max began to rebuild their lives. Max's wounds healed, and his spirit returned, though he remained wary of strangers. Emily knew he would always carry the scars of his past, but she also knew he was strong, a survivor in every sense of the word. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Emily found an old dog tag among Max's belongings. It was scratched and worn, but she could just make out the name engraved on it, Titan. She smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You'll always be my hero," she whispered. Max looked up at her, his eyes soft and trusting. In that moment, Emily knew they had found something rare and beautiful, a bond that would last a lifetime. But as the fire crackled and the night grew still, a chilling thought crossed her mind. Marcus Reed wasn't the only one involved in the dogfighting ring. Somewhere out there, others were still hunting, and they wouldn't stop until they found what they were looking for.